Hi, I'm Marc, and welcome to the weekly Outside Views report on politics in Africa and Arabia. Up to 1 million people have disappeared in Iraq in the past 5 years. This is the conclusion reached by a United Nations committee that has investigated and is now denouncing the mass disappearances of people. In Iraq, militias, army, and police organizations have made several 100,000 people disappear in recent years. That emerges from the UN report of the Committee on Enforced Disappearances, the CED, which was presented in Geneva but continues to the present. Numerous victims were forcibly abducted also abroad. In November, the committee visited Iraq for almost 2 weeks. The delegation included the German Barbara Lochbihler as vice chair of the panel. According to the report, the phenomenon of enforced disappearances was reflected in official statements by Iraqi authorities, while accurate data was likely to be obtained secretly. To date, however, there are no reliable figures. It is estimated that up to 290,000 people, including 100,000 Kurds, were swept away during the rule of the Ba'ath Party and Saddam Hussein from 1968 to 2003 alone. Hopes of relatives could still live in Iranian camps are there. According to the report, after the fall of Hussein, 96,000 Iraqis were temporarily held in US and British-run prisons, many without news for their families. Shortly before Easter, the situation in the Middle East escalated after a heavy rocket fire from Lebanon on Israel. Israel attacked bases of militant Palestinians in the neighboring country and in the Gaza Strip from the air on Friday night. The army blamed them for the fiercest attacks from Lebanon in a century and a half. In Israel, too, there were repeated alarms because projectiles were fired from the Gaza Strip. In the West Bank, 2 explicit women were killed after a suspected attack by Palestinians. According to the reliable army, dozens of rockets were fired from Lebanon into unlimited territory on Thursday. That's more than any since 2006. At that time, a war had broken out between the two sides. Both countries had been at war since 1978, according to Lebanese historian Makram Rabah. That was when Israel invaded Lebanon for the first time, and the conflict between the two began 30 years earlier. There's always tension at the border. Hamas, which rules in the Gaza Strip, also has great influence in the Palestinian refugee camps in Lebanon. Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu said his country's response would exact a heavy price on their enemies. In Yemen, the Shiite Houthi rebels have openly called for an end to the civil war in meetings with a representative from Saudi Arabia and Oman. The head of the High Political Council, Mahdi al-Mashhad, spoke out in favor of a just and honorable peace. The rebel-controlled Saba news agency reported this on Sunday. It said the two sides would negotiate, among other things, ending hostilities, lifting the Saudi-led blockade of Yemeni ports, and a timetable for the withdrawal of foreign troops. The deliberations are a ray of hope for impoverished Yemen and its people suffering from 8 years of war. They were made possible by a rapprochement between Saudi Arabia and Iran, who are struggling for dominance in the region. A few weeks ago, the two rivals agreed to resume diplomatic relations. Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu reversed the dismissal of Defense Minister Yoav Gallant after massive protests. The head of government announced in Tel Aviv on Monday evening that Gallant, who like himself belongs to the right-wing conservative Likud party, is returning to office. "We will work together for Israel's security," said Netanyahu. The head of the right-wing religious government had dismissed Gallant last month because he had called for a halt to the controversial judicial reform. There were immediately new protests on the street against the approval. The opposition and experts alike commented that the sacking was unprofessional in view of the precarious security situation in Israel. The Central African country of Chad has expelled the German ambassador. In a statement on Friday evening, Chad's government called on Jan Christian Gordon Krikke to leave the country within 48 hours. The government of the country with 17 million inhabitants justified this with a rude attitude of the German diplomat and his lack of respect for diplomatic customs. There was no further justification for this step. Local media suspect criticism of the current interim government as the background. According to the German Foreign Office, the reasons for the expulsion of the ambassador are incomprehensible. The office is in contact with the government in Chad. The country in the Sahel region, which is characterized by poverty and corruption and borders on Libya in the north and the Niger in the west, has been governed by President Mahamat Idris Deby Itno since April 21. His father, longtime ruler Idris Deby, was killed by rebels in the north of the country. Deby Itno had promised to hold democratic elections within a year and a half. In the autumn of last year, there were demonstrations by the opposition, which were brutally suppressed. Many diplomats in the country had sharply criticized the violence. Kricke has been ambassador to Chad since 2021, and meanwhile he has returned to Germany. About 10 people in the Democratic Republic of the Congo, 10 million people are in need of humanitarian assistance due to violence by armed groups. This is reported by Oxfam, the Danish Refugee Council, and by CARE International. More than 26 million people have not had enough to eat because of years of conflict, as Oxfam country director Justine Gomes-Tusu said. Hundreds of thousands of farmers have been forced off their land due to the recent violence and are unable to start the new planting season. Almost 60,000 children are malnourished. The difficult security situation is hampering the delivery of relief supplies, they say. According to the information, almost 1,400 civilians have been killed since the beginning of the year due to ongoing conflicts in the east of the country. According to the aid organizations, sexual violence against women and girls have also increased. According to the UN, 5.8 million people are internally displaced in Congo. That's the highest number in Africa. The east of the land is considered one of the most dangerous regions in the world. Around 130 different armed groups are said to be active in this country. The ADF, the Allied Democratic Forces, rebels from neighboring Uganda, who have been active in Congo for almost 30 years, have joined the Central African offshoot of the Islamist terrorist militia Islamic State. In the unstable province of North Kivu, rebels from Group M23 are also fighting, which UN experts say are supported by neighboring Rwanda, although the neighboring state denies this. The Rhineland-Palatinate State Parliament is working more closely with a partner country, Rwanda, on commemoration work. Psychological help for traumatized victims in the East African country is also being considered, said State President Henrik Hering to the German press agency in Mainz on the occasion of the Genocide Memorial Day on April 7th. The genocide of the Tutsi minority began on April 7th in 1994. 800,000 people were murdered in a terribly bestial manner, Hering recalled. People were affected in many places in Rwanda, whether as victims or perpetrators. Apparently, perpetrators in Rwandan families sometimes do not talk about it or they deny how they were involved in the genocide. He found that out in many conversations during a trip to Rwanda, as Hering says. Young people in particular want an obviously honest approach to this topic in families, said Hering, and also reported on traumatized women who were young mothers at the time. Psychological counseling is particularly in demand. The state parliament will also make available to Rwanda the results of the research project on the memories of families from the Nazi era. Scientists from the University of Koblenz are investigating this on behalf of the state parliament. According to Hering, this is based on the realization that in the generations of grandchildren and great-grandchildren, the experience of the ancestors is often presented in a distorted manner, and this endangers the necessary culture of remembrance. The German Bishops' Conference has condemned the recently passed homosexual law in Uganda. The persecution must stop not only in Uganda, Nigeria, Russia, but everywhere in the world, demanded the LGBTQ representative of the Bishops' Conference, Essen's Auxiliary Bishop Ludger Schepers, on Thursday. The Ugandan parliament passed an anti-gay law in March. I reported on it, and accordingly, people who carry out homosexual acts in the East African country or do not report attempts at homosexual acts can be sentenced to 7 and 10 years in prison or heavy fines. In the worst case, homosexuals who are guilty of what they call serious crimes can even face the death penalty. The parliamentarians did not specify which offenses are included in detail. As a church, which unfortunately itself can look back on a long tradition of queer hostility and is currently struggling to overcome this attitude, we must not remain silent in the face of these measures, said Schepers. Human rights apply to everyone. Only recently did Pope Francis make it clear the criminalization of homosexuality is unjust. And this concludes this week's report on Africa and Arabia. The next report on another topic is right here in the end screen. I'll see you there. I'll be back.